Okay, we are recording. Hi, everybody. This is David P. France, and I'm coming to you from Basel, Switzerland. Before we get started, I'd like everybody who's out there to like the videos that you watch, subscribe to our YouTube channel and BitChute channel, David P. France TV, and also share the video with your friends and family. Let them know what we're up to. We are profiling creators and creative people, artists, writers, of course, inventors, thought leaders, small business owners, and entrepreneurs. And today I have the great pleasure of speaking with someone who I haven't seen in a long time. I mean, I've seen her on social media and so on. I'm speaking with Professor Duchess Harris. How you doing, Duchess? How are you? It's been a long time.
I'm fantastic. It is nice to see you. It's been 32 years.
Really? Mm-hmm. Well, you know what? We're gonna come back to that because I think it's strange. I don't feel middle-aged, but I guess we are technically middle-aged. And Duchess is a professor of American Studies at Macalester College, right? Mm-hmm. And this college is in St. Paul, Minnesota. How long have you been there? You've been there for a while, right?
26 years.
Wow. Now, again, let me disclose that Duchess and I know each other from the University of Pennsylvania, and you guys who are out there know how I feel about the school. I give it a plug every single time. I'm speaking with someone that has graduated from the school. Proud alum, and it is what it is, right? But I think you and I were 2 years apart back then, and I just remember, and I think we talked about this during the pre-interview. I had heard a lot about you, but I didn't necessarily know what you were up to. I would always hear threads of things, right? Duchess is doing this, or Duchess is doing that, et cetera, et cetera. And likewise, as I started on my journey, and I, moved to Washington, D.C., and then New Orleans for law school and business school. I still would hear little things about what you were up to. So I'm not totally unfamiliar with your career and your choices and so on. But if you could tell everybody else, what you have become, what you've been up to.
Sure. I mean, well, if we start with Penn, when I was in my first year at Penn, there was a Black student named Quintus Jett. And I think Quintus was in your class. I think he was 89 and I was 91. And Quintus was on the undergraduate assembly, which was the mainstream student government. And the way that was set up is that they had arts and science representatives, a nursing representative, Wharton representatives, and then engineering. Quintus was in engineering, and he ran for a spot in student government and got on as a Black guy, which for, people my kids' generation, they've seen Black United States president, Black vice president of the United States, right? It's like, what would be the big deal of student government? This was 87. This was huge. And so after Quintus won, he went around to all the dorms, right? And sometimes I feel like I have to talk to young people that we didn't have email chains back then. You didn't have that in 87. And we didn't have cell phones. You call people on their dorm phone. So instead of doing all that, what was easiest was just door knocking. So he just went around and found Black people and said, do you want to run for student government? And I'm a big extrovert, I like things like that. It sounded interesting. I was like, I'll run. And so I got out there and I ran, and it changed me because it exposed me to all different kinds of Penn students. And so my class had 2,500 students in it, which at the time was one of the biggest entering classes. And so all the varying kind of interests and constituencies ended up in student government. And it also exposed me to some hostilities that I kind of had underestimated. I didn't realize that there would be people who might be resentful that someone like me was on student government. And so long story short, spring semester of my junior year, I ran for the chair, which is student body president. And I actually won. It was a big to do because at first I think it was a tie, and then we had the runoff, and then I eventually squeezed it out. And it ended up being a big thing. I didn't realize it at the time. I was the first Black woman to head up a student government in an Ivy League. And so this was spring of 90. And Penn at this time, as you know, because we were there together, had racial strife that was making the A section of the New York Times. Like that's the level of racial strife. And so when I ended up becoming visible like that, and also because you're young, you don't really realize what the visibility will be. Like for me, this was my club. This was my extracurricular. I just had the passion. I ended up getting death threats. And I actually was offered a walking guard.
Are you
And
serious?
this is the first time I'm talking about this publicly. So I'm like, okay, I was invited on David P. France. I'll tell my story now. Right? I was offered a walking guard.
By whom? By the university?
Yes, by the vice provost of University Life.
Who is Dr. Cade at the time?
Valerie Cade McCullum, who is still there, who is still a dear friend of mine. Mm-hmm. She said, you need an escort. And I've always been someone that respected authority, and she wouldn't want me to refer to her as an elder, right? She's probably only 15 years older than we are. And I looked at her and I said, no, thank you, ma'am. I said, I'm going to walk this walk. Mm-hmm. Now, I'm not bragging because that's probably crazy.
So why, I mean, why did you feel like you had to turn down, or why did you turn it down rather? Why did you turn down have you thought about it?
I thought it would be conspicuous. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I mean, how are we going to hide this, right?
Right, sure.
So I'm sitting down, you can't see me. I'm 5'1". When I was in college, I probably weighed 110 pounds. Me walking around with like some 6'2", 30-year-old dude, like who's not going to notice that, right? I mean, that it just felt ridiculous to me. I was like, why should I walk around with campus security? I felt like it would draw even more attention to myself. And as we know, some schools don't have the capacity to have a daily paper. The Daily Pennsylvanian actually has more circulation than the Philadelphia Inquirer, and it's independently run and independently funded, like outside of the university. Maybe for 3 days, people might not have noticed that I was walking around with some 6'2", 30-year-old dude. But I think somebody would have caught on to it if he was like standing outside the classroom when I was, trying to get my schoolwork done.
Right. So you're getting death threats. This is a pretty big deal why do you think that it was to the level where you were getting death threats? I mean, when you think about it now, you said, okay, this is my club. This was my club.
It was like, these were my buddies.
Right. So
I didn't understand, however, the possessive investment, and that's a term some sociologists use, right?
Uh-huh.
The possessive investment. It is like the stake that people have in politics, right? Mm-hmm. Easy to understand that now with everything that's happened, in the last 4 years. But you have to figure that, when you finished in 89, like I was 20, right? I was 20 years old, and I didn't realize that when Conrad Tillard invited Louis Farrakhan to campus, that people said that they were willing to die for that. Okay. And the people who were oppositional to that. And that is when we ended up in the A section of the New York Times. Sure. And that is when Valerie Swain Cade McCullum and I stood in line together. You had to get tickets. It was getting into the auditorium. And I sat with her with the college dignitaries. And we were scared. And Farrakhan came with 400 Fruit of Islam who walked the streets of West Philadelphia. And there were people in West Philadelphia who said, we are going to kill him and anybody around him.
I remember,
You
and I can't
remember that?
remember, I can't even remember if I was in the auditorium for that. I don't think I went to that event. I think because there was so much hype and so much controversy around it, I just said, I'll get the crib notes. Like I already know, like I felt like I was living it.
You were living it, and let me tell you, if you didn't get there early, they wouldn't have let you in. There was capacity in the auditorium. It would have been a fire hazard. Like you had to be in a seat, so it couldn't be standing room only. And it was managed by campus police. But I think also Philadelphia police were like in the vicinity. And so reading about it in the Daily Pennsylvanian was probably smarter than what I was doing. Is like, you know, this young girl from Connecticut. I mean, that's the other thing. It's not even like I grew up in this way where I was like, you know, I know conflict. Like I'm you know, I'm ready to take this on. I think I ended up there out of naivete.
And so this experience, which we've, you know, I'm involved in a lot of different volunteer positions at the University of Pennsylvania. We've relayed this particular event for a variety of different people, variety of different departments, rather, people in those departments. We've explained to them how seminal, pivotal this event was for Black students at Penn, and how the relationship, race relations were back then. And it's almost as if, I'm not saying people discount it or dismiss it, but in this day and age, the people don't necessarily have experience understanding it, right?
And also with my academic training, right, and I look at time periods, okay, the story sounds off. That's, I think, why a lot of people cannot take it in. And the reason why the story sounds off is like, you know, I'd been Charlene Hunter Galt, who desegregated University of Georgia in the 60s, right? That's like, oh, that story makes sense. We're talking late 80s, early 90s. People are like, there was that kind of racial strife didn't exist, late 80s, early 90s. I mean, in some people's imaginations, right? So when I tell the story, people are like, well, how old are you? Right? They're like, there's no way in the world that this was your college experience.
But they don't understand that, what is it, the Civil Rights Act of 64, right? I mean, that's when we were being born, like right after that period. So it's not going to just all of a sudden be over, even though.
So that's it. They think we're too young, even though we're in our 50s, right? They think we're too young for this story. They think this is a story for people who are in their early 70s. And what I try to convey to people is that this is actually our story too, because as you said, it wasn't finished. It wasn't like Charlene Hunter Galt was like, now I have a degree from University of Georgia, like we're done.
No. And one of the things that I did, and I also did this at Tulane, and we're going to go back. We got to make sure that we hit the fact that we're middle-aged, but we don't feel middle-aged. That's a whole other topic.
I feel fabulous.
You know, but one of the things I used to do when I didn't want to go to class, or I just felt bored, is that I would go to the library. Right? And even if I had known then what I know now, I would have lived in the library. But I probably wouldn't have been doing my work. I would have been looking up all the stuff that I wanted to look up. Now I have the internet, so I can get, I can get the things fairly quickly. But I remember just going through the stacks and looking up books on slavery. And they have books and documents that go all the way back to the time.
Extraordinary for the holdings that they have. It's an extraordinary place.
So I mean, you can see the history there. It's all there in the library, right? I mean, and I'm talking about like Civil War pre and post.
Yep.
right? And I think there is a difference with regard to how the younger people are processing being different, whether it be from race and gender, sexual orientation. It's very, very different. So when you come out and you say, hey, this is what happened, and I was at the Farrakhan event and I had death threats, to them, it just doesn't make any sense.
Right.
It doesn't make any sense.
None at all.
So how did this experience then influence your choice of career?
You know, that is the perfect question, because once again, you're getting some new stuff from me, right? People usually just start with, tell me about the recent thing that you've written. Oh, my apologies.
No, keep going. Yeah, of course, this is all live and real, right? So
right. So I have a standard poodle. People just say, you know, tell me about the recent thing you've written, but they don't really think about what the journey was. And what the journey was is that when I was a senior, I had to ask myself, do I want to go into politics? Because you have no idea how much I loved being in student government. I mean, it's like I ate it, drank it, slept it, right? So the question was, do I want to have this as a career path, or do I want to write about it? And so I decided to go to graduate school, and I got into the American Studies program at the University of Minnesota, which is one of the top programs. I'll be honest with you. I'm from the Northeast that I always said had like a 13 colony existence. Like the furthest west I think I'd been was like Harrisburg, right? So I was like, where's Minnesota? But it had a reputation because it was the first American Studies program in the nation. Harvard actually based their curriculum on Minnesota. And so I was like, okay, I'm gonna go study American culture, history, and politics, right? Of course, focusing on Black women. And my thought was, even though it was the PhD program, I was like, well, maybe I'll just get the master's and then go work on the Hill, right? I wasn't really committed to being an academic at first. But then when I got into the program, I decided what I wanted to write my dissertation on is what were Black women doing from the time of the March on Washington to the present politically, because most of the scholarship at the time was about men. Like it wasn't just about Martin Luther King. It was about like, you know, Lowry and C.T. Vivian and Bayard Rustin. And so it was all about the men, which that was important. But I was like, okay, but seriously, what were the women doing? So I got so taken by it that I just decided to stay and write up that work. And as I was doing that, there was this college that, I don't know, maybe 10 miles away that had this like crisis in the fall of '94, which was that they had this introduction to women's and gender studies course that was filled, but the professor had some kind of illness, wasn't going to be able to teach it. And it was like maybe 2 weeks before classes were starting.
Wow.
So they called over to the University of Minnesota and they said, you know, do you have an advanced graduate student who could do it? And so they were like, oh yeah, we know this person who can do it. So to date myself, I had to put my resume in the US mail because we had email, but we didn't have email attachment. Okay.
Yes, that's right.
Right. And so then I waited for them to call me on a landline. And just by looking at my resume, they took me.
Right.
Here's the rub. The rub is I put the dates on, so I wasn't dishonest, but they were so flustered. They saw what I had done, but didn't look at the dates. So when I showed up, I was 25.
Right.
So it's 94. I'd finished college in 91. So I was only 3 years older than the seniors.
Right.
And they had already hired me to teach this class. So they were concerned. Which I mean, now that I've been a department chair and I'm, you know, double more than 25, I can understand their concern now. But I went in and I just did it. And the young people could relate to me. You know, we listened to the same music, we understood each other. And so they kept asking me back. And then I finally finished my degree in 97. Then they had me do a visit, 97, 98. like a full-time visit. That's 5 different classes.
Okay.
And then they realized that there could be a target of opportunity to make me tenure track. And that would have been 98.
Wow.
And then so it was written.
Oh,
So
it's
it was
incredible.
written.
Incredible.
But I mean, to show up there 3 years after I finished college, and I tried to like, look grown. I was like, I'm gonna wear lipstick. And people were like, who is this? Trying to teach some college students.
But you had enough experience, and this is just based on what I can discern and what I did discern back then. I mean, it's in line, like it's in line with it. It's not far flung or far fetched. With in terms of what I know about you, right? Like I'm not. It's a great story, but it also fits. Do you understand what I'm saying?
I mean, it fit because anyone who knew me at Penn knew that you could always find me reading Black literature. So it fit because even though I was young, I had read all of it. I mean, I even did my qualifying exams the week that I started teaching at Macalester.
Okay.
So this is true story. I picked up my qualifying exam on Labor Day. They let us do that. They were like, okay, for the people that are going to do the fall one, we'll leave it open. It was probably only 2 or 3 of us. You can come pick up your exam in person on Labor Day. And so I started working on it, and you have 1 week to do this project. I started teaching at Macalester on Wednesday. And to give you an idea of what the project is that you have to prove fluency, both in a 30-page written thing, and then they grill you for 2 hours later on 300 books.
300 books.
300 books.
But do they pick the books, or you give them a list?
You pick the books, but you pick the books because you're picking your field.
That's right. Okay.
So when you pick your field, like if I said I was doing Black women's literature, it's not like I could go in there and be like, no, who's Alice Walker? Right. I mean, once you pick your field, you have to read everything in the field. And so there it was, 300 books.
Yeah, but you obviously you passed and
but I mean that was it. And so that kind of made up for, in people's minds, a professor is who I am now, right? Like not a 25-year-old.
I understand. But you had a professor-like persona at Penn. You know that, right? I'm just saying. I'm not saying that I looked at you.
I was a nerd.
But I knew, I was like, she's doing stuff. Like in my mind, you know what I mean? I was like, oh, and later on after you had graduated, as I was doing whatever I was doing, we talked about this before. I would hear about you. Oh, you need to talk to Duchess because she will understand what you're doing. Something to that effect. Unfortunately, I don't know. I think people only saw me as a dancer because, right? But I was behind the scenes doing a lot of foundational work with people. Right. I think that's what it was. I don't want to say I was a community organizer because that's too strong of a term. It's too strong of a term.
I saw you as a connector.
Yeah.
Like I can remember the first time I really knew who you were. And I think it's when your alpha line crossed. So of course I went to the show, right?
Just Alpha Phi Alpha fraternity and the step show, right? The pro show, right? The pro show,
Incorporated, right?
Yes, right. And the pro show is the show that is organized right before the line of the fraternity brothers. You become a Sphinxman, which is when you are online, and then you become a full-fledged brother, right? So you were there at that event.
I was at that event, and particularly your line, because I was a little bit younger than you all were.
Right.
So I think it's the first line I ever saw.
Right.
Woo! You all were everything. Everything. Like I was just like a little nerdy girl from Connecticut. You all were everything.
So we brought it.
That was my first thought of you. I was like, first of all, like he's an alpha. So say no more. And I'll tell you a little bit about my family connection to alpha too.
Okay.
And then like the way that you did navigate campus, I was like, oh, he brings people together. He's like one of those people, like he's a connector. He's over here, he's over there. And so, you know, it was an admiration thing and, you know, somewhat of a fangirl type thing too, because I really admired the students who were further along in the journey. Because as you and I talked about previously, you don't really get that journey, right? I don't care what kind of background you're from. If you were Black in the 80s, you probably were not familiar with that journey. And so watching you all do it and do it well, and like, I'm not overly stroking you. I mean, I looked at you all and I was like, oh, okay, they get it. That was inspiring.
Yeah.
So let me give you a little bit about my connection to Alpha.
Okay.
My connection to Alpha is that my great uncle, who lived to be, I think, 99, he just passed away a few years ago. His name was Jap Curry. He wrote the Alpha Sweetheart song.
Okay. So he was one of the
He was definitely one of the first.
The early.
Yeah, because Uncle Jap, he would have been born in the early 1900s.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, tell us a little more about your family background. You grew up in Connecticut. How did you, as your family, get to Connecticut? And the reason why I'm asking is, you know, and I've said this before to people, who you're related to, your family ties. This is really, really important, and for everyone, right? But specifically for Black people in America, a very specific story, which makes our time in America unique.
Yeah. Like many Black families, my relatives came from the South, you know, out of, you know, plantation culture. And so I was born in Virginia.
Wow.
But we moved to New England when I was 2. And the reason why we moved is that my dad was the first Black air traffic controller at Patrick Henry Airport in Virginia. He desegregated it.
Wow.
And so he became an air traffic controller in 1960. And the way he got his job was similar to the way that I got my job at Macalester. He got it on paper. He took the civil service exam. He passed it. They wrote him, you know, dear Mr. Harris, you know, we're delighted to inform you, blah, blah, blah. He shows up and they take one look at him and they were like, oh, we can't let you have this job. And so my dad had been a serviceman. When he finished high school, he went directly into the military and then used that as a way to go to college because he came from a pretty impoverished background from Alabama. And so my dad said, I'm a vet and I'm going to write my senator because this is unconstitutional. So he ends up writing one of the senators of Virginia at the time, which I actually think was a Republican senator, and said, look, you know, I was in the service, I served my country, and I took the test and passed it, and clearly I can have this job. And I misspoke, it actually wasn't Army, it was Air Force, which is why his interest in air traffic control. So he ends up getting the job. What's interesting though, was that he only got in a little bit, right? Because he only could do private planes. That generation of Black people couldn't do commercial planes.
Look,
now,
I mean,
right?
this is incredible. Keep going.
Right.
I mean,
Isn't this incredible?
Yeah.
But this has a happy ending.
Okay.
And the reason why it has a happy ending is that when people remember that the air traffic controllers went on strike in the 80s and Reagan fired them,
yes,
my family would have been belly up if my dad had lost his job because my mom had stayed at home. It was the commercial air traffic controllers that were on strike.
Not the private.
So he ended up, you know, having his entire career, you know, retiring, you know, with, you know, dignity and having that pension. And the timing of that strike was when I was in high school.
Right.
And if he'd been a commercial air traffic controller, I probably never would have ended up at Penn.
Yeah.
I don't know if they would have been able to pay the mortgage.
It's amazing. I mean, and this is these stories with this story, it's
Hmm.
the type of story that, again, if you told your students,
Oh yeah.
they would look at you like, and do you feel like, I mean, can you rest on that story? Can you actually, because I feel like at some point when you tell these stories, that people, the stories fall on deaf ears, right? And
Right.
sometimes is it even appropriate to bring it up because we're
Right.
living in a time period
Mhm.
where people cannot relate to
Right.
what is happening. Like, so for example, even in the current political environment, we're living and we're seeing all types of advancement, you know,
Hmm.
people who are Black, people who are other minorities doing great things, doing interesting things. When you tell somebody that someone was excluded or
Hmm.
was on the brink of being excluded because they were Black, it just, as you say, it just rings. How did you characterize it earlier? It just sounds off. It
Right.
sounds so off to people, right?
But this is where I'm fortunate, right? Where I'm
Okay.
fortunate is that I have a platform. And so one of my platforms is writing these books for 4th to 12th graders.
Mhm.
And a book that I wrote recently was about a man named Calvin Spann. And Calvin Spann was Gay Spann's dad, whom we went to college with.
That's right. And he
And
was part
so
of
here's
the,
right. So here's the story. Calvin
yeah.
Spann was a Tuskegee Airman.
Hmm.
And so I wanted my son, who is in high school now, but like for his 5th grade biography project. And if anyone has kids, they know standard 5th grade curriculum, you write a story about someone. Well, I didn't want him to write a story about like Booker T. Washington or Rosa Parks, because everybody has those stories, right?
Sure,
So I was
sure.
like, let's find someone that even the teacher might not heard of. Now, when I ended up, he did his book report, he illustrated it, the class thought it was fun, and then I decided to turn it into a children's book. I
Hmm.
reached out to Gay.
Hmm.
Her father's story is similar. Her father ended up becoming a Tuskegee Airman, and when World War II was over, and he came back to the United States, and he goes back to Jersey, they
Right.
won't let him be a pilot.
Yeah, yeah, of course.
They won't let him be a pilot. So what does he end up doing? He ends up being a pharmaceutical rep. Then he ends up being a consultant for the movie Red Tails, and then there's like this new invigorated interest,
Right.
right? And then in retirement, he ends up traveling everywhere talking about being a Tuskegee Airman. But people need to know
Of
that
course.
the Tuskegee Airmen were not allowed to be pilots. And people need to know when my family left Virginia, it's because my dad was allowed to work at Logan Airport in Boston, which is
Jesus.
a huge airport compared to like,
Hmm.
Patrick Henry in Virginia. It was still private planes, but it was huge. So we were in the Boston area, I don't know, like 8 years. And then the reason why we went to Hartford, and Connecticut only has one airport, is that he was allowed to become a supervisor. And so he ended his career as a supervisor.
Wow.
Now, he was completely overqualified for that,
Sure,
just the way
sure.
Gay's dad was completely overqualified for what he was doing. But it was an entree, right? So now Black people can have this job.
It's amazing. It's amazing because as you're talking, like the hairs, what little I have on my arm are like, because relative to the 80s, something similar happened to me, but it pales in comparison, right? Because there had been or there was progress from the 60s to the 80s. Still, though, let's say, for us, when we went on interviews, it was like, you understand what I'm saying, right? Like it wasn't an automatic that because we graduated from the University of Pennsylvania, Ivy League, blah, 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 that was going to even open a door. So
Oh, 100%.
you
And the
understand
way,
what I'm saying, right?
in the way that, your experience and my experience can kind of mirror each other.
Yes.
What I know for certain, given the leadership roles I've had now at Macalester, what I know for certain is if they had met me I wouldn't have gotten that job. And it wasn't just about age. Because I will tell you this, the doors of Macalester opened in 1874. I'm the first Black woman to be promoted to full professor.
Yeah, we have a lot of work to do.
Yeah.
we still have the work.
Right. So I mean, I know for certain that if that hadn't been sight unseen, that I'd have a very different story. And see, you didn't have the advantage of that because you were going into a world where they were like, well, Mr. France, come in, you know, and you were going to put your suit on and they were going to say, so tell us about yourself. And before you could even get out the door of, you know, I'm David P. France and, you know, I'm all credentialed and pedigreed, they're looking at you like,
Like I was out of my mind.
Right.
I was out of my mind. Hey, look, you know, I'm going to say this and then we're going to move on to the next thing. I want to ask you about your law school experience and how that shaped before you attended law school, your curriculum and what you presented to students and afterwards. But I will say this, I think that those of us that came up in the 80s, we knew that we were breaking new ground, but then there was a part of us that felt, I wouldn't say that we felt entitled. That's too strong of a word, but it was as if we felt like, well, why not?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I would express it is that I think we felt beautiful and charmed.
Okay.
And one of the reasons why I say that is the pop culture around us. Like,
Yes,
as you know, right, every Thursday night, everyone gathered around and watched Cosby.
Right.
And then people watched A Different World. And we felt like that we were them and that we were going to go and take it on. As one of my English professors at Penn, Houston Baker, who's now at Vanderbilt, would say, you all are the new Negroes, right? So the new Negroes were like the Harlem Renaissance Blacks of the 20s.
Yes.
And so he would say, y'all are like the new Negroes. But I think we felt, you know, blessed. Like you said, it wasn't like an arrogance. It wasn't an entitlement, but it was like, oh, you know, the light is shining on us and we can walk into it. And some of it's just naivete. Like, I'm a mom, you know, my daughter's 17, like, you know, she sees no barriers. Right. And I mean, and I look at her and I think to myself, when I was that age, I was thinking, why can't I just go to a public speaker? Like, there's not going to be any problem with that. Right. But I mean,
look. Let me tell you something. Yeah, talking to you, I mean, I'm telling you, it's like I'm vibrating because part of the reason why I made this platform, that I developed this platform was, you know, the main concern was that we were going into a pandemic, right? And I knew that areas such creative people, people that are thought leaders, people who are starting small businesses, these are really, really important, right? Really important people, because they're the ones that bring the ideas forth mostly, right? Usually it's the big corporation that buys the idea from the inventor, right? Or will buy a smaller company that was started by an entrepreneur. So I've always had a respect for these people. But then as a part of it, which you just touched on, which is, I just feel like Generation X, that generation's story has not been fully told.
I agree with you.
It has not been fully told.
I agree with you.
I've gone as far as to say, with regard to Penn, I mean, Penn, this is a very important part of, like, you know, our coming up.
Yeah.
I look at what's out there, you know, representing Penn, and we're not there. Like, we're not there in the discussion, right? So part of what I'm doing is helping to get people familiarized with who we are. And it's not just, you know, people that went to Penn and other schools as such, but it's Generation X, because what I find is that when you look at us, we're doing all kinds of intersectional work. We're doing all kinds of what I call bridge work. And we came in as the bridge, like we were educated to be the bridge, right? And we're still the bridge. And so sometimes when you you're the bridge, you're not the one that's going to benefit from what has been created, right? It's going to be your children, their children, right? And maybe the people that were before us felt the same way, right? But Houston Baker did say that we were the new Negroes. I don't know exactly what we have to ask what that is, but somehow we were the new, right?
You know, I mean, he meant it as a compliment in the sense as like the shiny, the future, the vision, right? Like he was very excited about that. And his son was 2 years behind me. And so he was invested in our generation.
Right. That's interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. And I would also say this is another observation, that at the time when we were coming out trying to get jobs, the people that really had the power positions were mainly white men. Right.
Yeah.
White straight men. So everybody had to go to them, or you know, eventually it would lead to somebody in that group. And I would even suggest that we weren't the only ones that had to maneuver in such a way in the 80s. And I was telling you this before. I talked to someone who I hope to interview very soon, who was a model, and her story is very similar to ours, only she was in a different industry. Yeah, so she had to worry about her hair. There's a whole thing about her hair. and there's a whole thing about when she was asked a job, she did whatever they asked her to do.
Yeah.
So she said, if they want my hair short, I did it short. If they wanted me to change it, I'd change it. Right. And there are some people that would be like, I'm not doing that. Or God forbid that you would even change your style without asking them, you know, the agency for permission.
Right.
And I think another thing was that before she came into the industry, there were certain contracts that were low contracts. And then all of a sudden in the 80s, because of what was happening pop culture wise, these contracts started to get big. So it was really like who would get the contract, and whoever got it, it was sort of like, you know, similar to what you were going through, is like, oh, she got that contract.
Right.
You know what I mean? So I would say that. And I think also in the 80s, when you think about other things like the entertainers, right? So when you talk about Bill Cosby and you talk about the effect of that, you talk about Prince and Michael Jackson, you know, these two were breaking. I mean, things didn't go easy for them as well, meaning on their level. Michael wasn't even being, you know, asked to be on MTV. He was not. He and Prince were the first, I think, to break through, because they
and look at what happened to Michael Jackson and Prince.
Yeah, I know.
Right? Like look at that. Neither one of them are with us. Look at what happened to Whitney Houston.
Yeah, I know.
I mean, when I was in high school, I was like, Whitney Houston's like the big girl, right? Like because maybe Whitney Houston's like 5 years older than I am. And, you know, having grown up in Connecticut and she's from Jersey, and oh my God, I was like, she's so beautiful and she sings so well. And I mean, I was just so into it. And then as her life unfolded, I was like, look at
it was shocking.
These challenges. Shocking. Look at this.
And we think, and this is to my point, even though we were in that world, right? They were facing challenges, similar challenges, but in different formation, right? So let's say like we were looking at them like, oh, they're living this life and they have all this money. But meanwhile, their hands were literally tied. I mean, and we can even look at somebody like Mariah Carey, who's recently come out with a bio, who basically said that was the case. She couldn't even leave the house. You know what I mean? Can you imagine? Can you imagine? You're a singer, you're worldwide, and you can't even leave the house without, you know, the security being called. So it again, it goes to how we came up in America, like our relationship with the rest of society, and certain specific things that we have gone through. And look, it's why I attended law school. And we can go into that. I knew when I graduated, I was like, Dave, you know nothing. You know nothing about nothing. You need to be in law school. You need to figure out what they know. You need to learn what they know. Now, I still don't know it. You know, I was just there learning the culture of being a lawyer. Now, I did work
Right,
for,
right.
I worked for law firms after
Okay,
graduation. So
okay.
I was really familiar with the culture, and I worked for very high level law firms.
Mhm.
Um, but I saw myself not being in Washington, but I wanted to go to New York. And
Okay.
the person who was at Tulane at the time said, I can get you into a firm into DC. He goes, I can't get you into New York. Because at that time, New
Yeah.
York was like,
Oh, it was all things. It was all
it,
things because I tell people all the time that I had friends at Penn that were just like, oh, she's different. And it was because I didn't want to go to Wall Street.
right, I understand.
So right, so they were like, she's friendly enough, but we don't really, we don't get her. Because if you didn't want to go to New York, there was something wrong with you. I mean, come on, David. Where's the lie? Where's the lie, David?
You're not lying.
There's something wrong with you.
You're not lying. You're not lying. I truly wanted to go to New York because I lived in Jersey, though, right? I mean, I was in Jersey coming up. So
Right.
I'm like, why am I going to go to Washington? Like, because.
Look, I see you. I tried to say Connecticut was the 6th borough one time, and people asked me to leave the room. They were like, take it elsewhere. Take it out. I was like, come on. They were like, no.
Hey, look, it's fascinating. We could go on and on. Let me throw this out to you, and then I'm going to ask you about your legal background. When I lived in Harlem, and I would take the train, and people can talk all they want about, oh, Harlem was great and all this other stuff. Look, Harlem's been struggling for a long time. So any little bit of economic development made news, right? So at the time, you remember when Bill Clinton got in office there?
Right.
And it was right around like 125th and stuff. So that's when like it was like, so somehow I got a job working in Connecticut as a legal, I guess, some sort of lawyer type person at Purdue Pharma. And at the time, Purdue Pharma was in Connecticut, it was Stanford, and they manufactured OxyContin, right?
Oh my.
So
you have stories.
Yeah. So I won't go into that, but the commute was very interesting to me because we would pass Greenwich, right? And I was like, oh, like, look, I'm not a wealthy person, right? But I am fascinated with all different types of worlds, right? So when I see, like, when we went through this area, a couple of stops before and then Greenwich and then after, my mind was blown. I was like, what is going on? And the people that would get off, and in order to get to Greenwich, if you were in New York, you had to go to the 125th train stop because that's where the train started. So people from the Upper East Side would come to Harlem just to catch that train. And that's when I was like, uh-oh, there's something else going on here. I could sniff, I could feel it. When we made that stop, it was like literally one of the times where I felt like we were similar to when I was at school, right? Similar to, I was like, oh, this is an extension of, what I know from.
Yeah. This is actually the ruling class.
Thank you.
Right? That's what this is.
Oh, and look, you guys, I don't want you to misjudge me because I get so excited about it, right? Because my excitement is not that. It's just that it was familiar to me, but not in the way that I was a part of it. Do you understand what I mean?
Oh, well, none of us are ever like we're never really a part of it. And just because.
And why do you say that? Why do you say that?
Because just because we're invited doesn't mean we're in it. You can be in something and not of it.
And do you think that's still true today?
I mean, I don't think it's true for Kamala Harris.
But her experience, and we'll say that, and I got to ask you about law school. There are a lot of people who say, okay, and we can talk about subconscious versus conscious. When you're raised as a descendant of slaves,
right,
that subconscious, that
Right.
thought is very different
It's very
from
different. And she's
from
not just
someone who is of immigrant background
right.
and whose parents were not part of that as well, right?
Yeah,
And
exactly.
have a different, because it's almost like in
Mhm.
order to understand that experience, you had to be in it.
Right.
And
Right.
because she wasn't in it, it almost is like similar to maybe the way your children operate now. They're like, well, I can do anything I want. You know, I mean,
Right.
I can move in
Hmm.
a way because this is familiar to me. This is not, that's
Yeah.
what some people would say.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that that's an excellent analysis. I agree with that 100%. But I would
Mhm.
say most um, American descendants of the slave trade, and we used to just call ourselves Black folks in the 80s, most of the people of our generation from that background
Uh-huh.
are invited to the party, but we're really not the party.
Now,
Right.
why do
I
you,
mean, I get invites to lots of stuff, and you get invites to more because you're a part of the Penn Fund. So I mean, you get invited to stuff that it's like I'm not even near that list, right? But
Mhm.
I'm not sure I'm of it.
Well, this is what I would say. Um, I do think that there's a shift going on.
Oh
And
yeah.
it's not like like in the 80s. It's not
Mhm.
like it was in the 80s. However, I mean, we're 50, we're middle aged now, right?
Right.
And with that comes, this is my argument, comes a certain opening,
Okay.
opportunity.
Okay.
Now, it may not look like the people that get out at Greenwich, right? It
Yeah.
may not look like that, right? Because, because I got excited, like, who in the hell are these people, right? And then,
Right.
of course, every time I was looking forward to the commute just to see who would get off.
Oh
You
yeah. Oh
understand?
heck yeah.
But I do think
Yeah.
there's an opening, and it doesn't look like everybody else's opening. It
Sure.
does. It just by virtue of who we are, it doesn't
Yeah.
look
I love
like,
that. I
right,
love that.
right. So it's
It's a different
unique.
window.
It's a
It's a
different
window,
window.
but it's a different one.
It's a different window. It's an opportunity, and it's going to look different than anybody else's, but it's still going to be an opportunity
Sure.
because there's a need, whatever that
Hmm.
need is, we'll figure it out. And we, because we're the bridge,
Hmm.
have been specifically trained, and we have experience to be the bridge for not just our group, but
Hmm.
for a lot of different groups that aren't even in, you know, in our group,
Right.
right? So that's how I see it now. That
Hmm.
still means that what you're saying is somewhat true, right? Like
Yeah.
I'm still not, you know what I mean? Like I'm still not a part of that because I'll never be, and that's not how I grew up. But when you come up and you're taught from a very like young age, from 0 to 7, you can do anything you want, and we will support you. And uh, let's take you to these, we'll send you to this lesson, and we're gonna
Yeah.
make sure you get this schooling, and that's a whole. And you never talk negative
Right.
about like what you doing over there. Who you think you are? You think you're white or anything? That doesn't even come up.
Right.
It's a different thing now, right? It's a different child coming out of that environment versus how we came up.
Yeah.
Because we would hear some of the discussions, right? We would hear,
Oh my God. But I mean, my
yeah,
parents were born in the 1930s.
yeah, yeah,
So my parents did not live with white people until they were 35.
yeah.
And it's when we moved outside of Boston. Because my parents grew up in the segregated South. My mom grew up on the campus of Hampton University and never left it because there was an elementary school on campus. She didn't know anything about white people. And what's hilarious is that she's fairer skinned than I am. So people
Uh-huh.
have met my mom and been like, huh, right? But it's like when you start talking to her,
Right, right.
you realize that she's like, I don't know anything about this. Right? Just a
Amazing,
very different experience.
amazing, amazing. And look, we're going to get to the legal part, but I think even talking to you now, it resonates. I'm telling you, my skin is like going boo boo. It's resonating in such a way that I don't think talking to sort of just any old person.
Mm-mm.
Do you understand what I mean?
It's our story. And you're right. It's not Kamala's story, which is partly why I brought her up, because I was like, well, she's in it and of it. I was like, and then there's us, which is cool, right? Because I'm more than happy to be me.
Yeah.
But I really don't want people to think, because I am so fortunate, and I'm profoundly fortunate, right? That I have access to some of the things that our white classmates from Penn had.
Yeah.
Because I actually don't, even though I think I was just as talented as they were academically and extracurricularly. But this is about social networks, right? And the ruling class is about social networks.
Heck yeah, it is. It's amazing. So
Yeah.
tell us, I'm going to touch on 2 more points. When you decided to go to law school, how did you fit that in with everything else that you were doing?
So this was the thing. My last year of graduate school, I was writing my dissertation at this place called the Institute on Race and Poverty, which was a think tank at Minnesota's law school. So it was set up like a 9-to-5 job, and they had 2 fellows. And so one had just finished law school in May, like we started in September, and I was at the end of my dissertation. So I was kind of like a postdoctoral fellow, even though I wasn't really postdoc. And I loved the law, and I had the opportunity to renew that fellowship or do my visit year at Macalester. So I didn't want to risk the visit year at Macalester, so I left it. And so, but I always intellectually was drawn to the law. So once I got tenure, I was an older law student. I went to law school part-time at night when I was 37.
Right.
And so I went to this place called William Mitchell College of Law, which for people who are from elite spaces, they were like, what is that?
Sure.
But at the time, because I actually finished 10 years ago this month that I finished, at the time, there really weren't many part-time law schools, and there were no online law schools. And the reason why I know that is because William Mitchell was the first online law school to get American Bar Association accreditation. And so what their vision is, for people who don't know Minnesota, the metropolitan area is very booming. Minneapolis and St. Paul, millions of people. Minnesota, however, is a large state, and a huge pockets of the rest of the state are rural.
Sure.
And so people think of the Mayo Clinic, which is very sophisticated and global and cosmopolitan and has its own air landing strip and all this stuff. It is nestled in farmland. And so William Mitchell's vision was like, what are we going to do for the people that live here? They used to be called like outstate, right? Like, how are we going to get them to learn about, land law? Right. And so that's how they ended up with this evening program and this weekend program.
Right.
And so geographically, William Mitchell was almost walking distance from Macalester.
Right.
And so what I would do was I'd teach in the day, and then I'd go home and check on my kids, have dinner with the family. My kids were young enough that I'd actually put them down, and then I'd go back for what we called night school. And I'll have you know, I was in law school like on Friday nights until like 9 o'clock at night.
Sure.
Yeah. And I went because everyone was like, well, why'd you go? I went because my scholarship is around Black women. And a lot of people don't know that Black women never had a category legally where they had the apparatus to sue. And, you have a law degree, you're sitting here like, wait a minute, what's going on, this, that, and third, right? But it gets to your friend who is the model that had to be consumed with her hair. And so an important legal case was a flight attendant for American Airlines who wanted to wear her hair in braids because she was flying internationally, and there were places that she was landing that they couldn't manage her hair. They fired her, and they won. And the reason why they won is they said, clearly it's not racial discrimination. We have flight attendants like David. He has no problem with his hair. He's Black, right? And clearly it's not gender discrimination because we have flight attendants like Karen, right? And she doesn't struggle with her hair. Clearly this is like a personal problem,
Okay.
right? And
Uh-huh.
so if you take things like that for Black women to sue at the intersection of race and gender, that has been a journey both within courts and outside of courts for the last 3 decades. And so that's what I wanted to learn. I'm looking
I
at
mean,
your
I'm
face.
not laughing. I'm not
nervous.
laughing. I'm
I'm
laughing
nervous.
because you know why I'm laughing, right? Because it is reminding me of, I mean, I'm in Switzerland now, right? So
Right.
the situation is very, very different than in the United States. And when you and I are having this conversation, it is, can I use the word trigger? Trigger is too negative, but it is like triggering how things were when we were coming up. It really
Right.
is. It's like,
Right.
take things like that for granted, but there's still issues that are not resolved because, let's say, we're not litigators. We're not people bringing court cases in general. And in fact,
Right.
one of the reasons why I wanted to go to law school is that as an artist, even as a young person, people would hire me to do things, but I could never figure out how much I was going to charge.
Right.
And I didn't know what my rights were. Let's say if I were like, I was hired just for the job, and how long did the rights of that artwork, stay with me, or did it go to them? So I would, all of these issues, and it also had an impact.
Intellectual property, right? Who owns your intellectual property?
Who owns the intellectual property?
And you can be Prince, who has to end up being the artist formerly known as, right?
Exactly.
And so, we're not Prince, and we're like still trying to figure out how do we navigate this world of contract.
How about this? Even let's say, for example, when you have a lawyer, when you get a lawyer, lawyers are recommended. It's rare that somebody says, I need to get a lawyer, and they just sort of pick up the phone and they can call someone, right? It's very rare. It's all network based, as you know. So one of the issues that we talked about, or one of the issues that I was interested in, was access to legal services, right?
Yeah.
So I even did things like, and of course this didn't work out, like I did an externship where it was about prisoners' rights, and we went to Angola prison in
that's amazing.
Upward Louisiana.
Yeah, that's amazing.
And they wouldn't let me do anything. I was just sort of standing around. But at least I saw, what was going on, and I knew what the issues were. And when you talk about hair, and you talk about Black women not having legal precedent, is it, or they don't have a avenue,
right,
to be able to bring a case. It just really triggered me, right? Because
it's real.
Because of our situation in the United States, it's everything, and because it's economic, right? It's not just economic. It's political. It's economic, and it's also social, right?
And the way that I explained to my classmates how it was economic, I wouldn't have had the confidence to say this if I'd gone straight to law school the way some of you all went, like at a younger point in your life. If I were 22, I would have just sat there. As I said, I was 37. I already had tenure. I'd had 3 kids. And so I'm the only Black person in the law class. We're doing this case. I raised my hand and I said, listen, I know you all want to know. I said, Black women's hairstyles are regulated, and we are told what is professional, what is not professional. In fact, our natural hair was criminalized until 2020. 2020 was the year that the states of California and I think New York ended up with statutes where they said you can't fire someone for having natural hair. So up until 2019, in all 50 states in America, you could be fired for having natural hair. We passed the legislation in Minnesota last year as well, okay? One of our Black female state representatives, the first one to be elected in St. Paul, and she's only been in 10 years, got the Crown Act passed. So when we bring up the economics of this, what I told my classmates was, if you are getting your hair done in a way that corporate America will allow, not even validate, right, but allow, it could cost you $100 a week. $400 a month is a car payment, right? And it's $400 that if I weren't in academia, right, if I were in another line of work, $400 a month I would have to spend. Karen doesn't have to spend that, right? Not only that, Karen might make more than I do, right? And even if Karen didn't make more than I do, Karen might have access to resources that are multi-generational, what a scholar named Manning Marable would call, oh my gosh, he refers to it as, it's like this intergenerational either advantage or disadvantage, right? So if she has intergenerational advantage and makes more and doesn't have to spend $400 on her hair, that is why she's situated the way she is and I'm situated the way I am. Yeah, cumulative disadvantage. That's what the late, great Manning Marable would have called it.
Well, look, so one more thing, and we've
been on here forever. We gotta get off here.
We gotta get off. But you talk about your book collection, and then we'll jump, and then we'll have to come back and talk about.
We'll have to come back because this was like crazy fun. So I have a collection of 130 books, and they all deal with social justice, and they are in 2 imprints. And I will be honest and say, before I got into publishing, I didn't quite understand what an imprint was, but it's like a form of branding. And so one set is for 4th to 8th graders, and the other set is for 6th to 12th graders. Yes. And I deal with issues from the past, right? So it's like I might have a book about Reconstruction, but I also have a book that came out this month that's called Justice for George Floyd. Okay. So I'll just wrap it up on that note, that this is important for people all over the country. But I mean, it was a special gift for students in Minnesota because, as everyone would know, George Floyd was killed 15 miles from where I live.
Well, look, Duchess, it's been a pleasure. I mean, I felt like I was back in school, right? I mean, this is how we used to talk a lot when we had time, and even if we didn't have time. But thank you so much for making yourself available. It really has been like enlightening and plus, if that makes sense.
And that has been like a two-way street. You have given me light. Like I'm going to be walking around my house all day today, like, woo! I got the connection because we're quarantined, right? So I mean, I feel like it's like I've been to the club, the intellectual and the social club.
Well, look, we're gonna have you come back, right? We're gonna get some more interviews. I have some coming up tomorrow, and then the day after. For those of you who are interested in knowing more about Duchess, everything about her will be in the description box. If you want to get in touch with her, there will also be information there as well. And with that,
all right, nothing but love and light, man.
All right.
Okay, take care. All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.